All right, welcome to another installment of the Quadruple D. And this is technically episode 66, part 3, where I'm looking at Donald Trump Jr. And I'm asking what his biggest scandal is, and in what way, if any, does it actually sort of validate anarchist style critiques of political power? And it's always an interesting angle for me to explore these issues because obviously people like Donald Trump Jr. are supposed to embody the complete opposite of an anarchic style critique of power. They're supposed to validate the exact opposite sort of view. They're supposed to disprove radical critiques of power. But we're going to get into exactly what sort of contrast there is between the two. And based on my analysis of his career, I would say Donald Trump Jr.'s biggest scandal is widely considered to be his 2016 Trump Tower meeting with a Kremlin linked lawyer, in which he sought damaging information on Hillary Clinton, followed by subsequent revelations of his promotion of falsehoods to cover that up. So, obviously, there are probably some other scandals that you could point to, and go ahead and let me know about those in the comments section if there is a comments section, or you could kind of stalk me online perhaps. Send me an email if you know of a better scandal that I could have highlighted here, because this is a crime family, for lack of a better term. And more recently, in 2025 and 2026, he faced intense scrutiny for using his father's presidency to secure defense contracts for his private companies, including a $620 million loan for a rare earth startup. So that might actually be a comparable scandal, maybe a bigger scandal than the other one. I'll let you decide on that one. But here's my assessment of these actions, and I'm going to see if they validate that anarchic perspective. The silly billy anarchic types. So when it comes to the Trump Tower meeting, which was in 2016, it was in June 2016 to be more exact. Don Jr. attended a meeting arranged by a Russian intermediary with a Russian government linked attorney to obtain information as part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump. So, what would this entail from sort of an anarchic critique? Well, anarchism opposes the state and the legitimacy of campaign finance laws that seek to regulate the political power games of the ruling class. So, from this perspective, the outrage from liberal critics is less about the unethical nature of seeking foreign help and more about breaking the protocol of the ruling class. However, anarchists would view it as a perfect example of how states, politicians, and elites collude internationally to maintain power, with the so called national interest being a facade used to trick the public. And when it comes to that cover up aspect, well, Don Jr. initially claimed the meeting was about Russian adoption policies, a lie later dictated by his father. But anarchists would see this as typical behavior of rulers protecting their hierarchy from accountability, proving that in a state system, elites are rarely held to the same standards as average citizens. So let's look at the post 2024 business conflicts as well from this sort of perspective. So, as of April 2026, companies linked to Donald Trump Jr. or Don Jr. and 1789 Capital, a venture capital firm where he is a partner, have been implicated in receiving over $735 million in federal defense contracts and loans, including for rare earth startup named Vulcan Elements. Boy, they come up with some real weird names for these things, you know. But what about that anarchic assessment here? Those goofball weirdo lunatics. What would they have to say about this? Well, they would say this is a clear example of the merging of state and corporate power. See, anarchists do not focus merely on whether the transactions were legal, but on how the state, through the Department of Defense, as it's called, well, actually, now they call it more accurately the Department of War. But anyway, the state acts as a mechanism to transfer public funds into the hands of private elites. And, does that critique sound accurate? Yes, indeed, it does. That's exactly what this is. Now, I do actually kind of like that they're calling it the Department of War because that's what it actually is. So, with the liberal condemnation of that name change, you kind of get insight into the difference between the two parties. See, the the right wingers, they actually do want it to be a Department of War, but they're too stupid to understand that if you literally call it that, well, then that's what it's going to look like, and it's going to make it sound like it's a bad institution. You're kind of feeding the image that it's being run by warmongers and violent psychopaths, and you're also boosting the idea that it's being run in favor of private elites because, well, stereotypically, who benefits from war the most? That would be those same private elites that, make up the billionaire class, which is now fairly accurately called the Epstein class. Although, of course, not every millionaire or billionaire is necessarily caught in that net, but certainly a lot of them have been. And if you call it the Department of Defense, well, it makes it sound a little bit more, well, respectable. Like it's not just a bunch of bloodthirsty, war craving lunatics who maybe worship Satan or something like that. Not that I believe in Satan myself, as an atheist, but that it sounds more like an evil institution if you call it the Department of War. But I guess I give a little bit of credit for that name change because it, it's not it's not as smart from a propaganda perspective, but it's somewhat more honest in a way. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in the military is necessarily evil, but I'm not one of those people who's like always sucking up to the military, and that's why I'll never be a politician because I'm not going to be playing that game where I'm pretending like, oh yeah, I love the military, and it's not just the United States military; it's military establishments across the globe. And one of the things that I hate about the military, in fact, is that because so many countries on the earth have powerful militaries, it kind of validates the need for other countries to have militaries as well. So, like, one sort of evil feeds into another. And then, of course, you've got historical precedents as well, because we saw what happened in World War II with Adolf Hitler and all of these other powerful countries. And, we saw that, oh, military preparedness might be necessary sometimes. So, you end up with a scenario where basically it makes sense to have a military. It's similar to if a country has nuclear weapons, well, it makes sense for you to have nuclear weapons if they have them. It's called a deterrent. And, when it comes to corruption, too, in the government in general, well, if this political party is allowed to be corrupt, then maybe we should be corrupt as well. And it that's like one of the trickle down effects when it comes to the actual economy and how it functions because we see the rich being corrupt and lying and cheating and stealing, and then we think, well, hey, maybe I should lie and cheat and steal as well. And you hear crazy and hateful rhetoric coming from politicians, and you're like, you know what? Yeah, if they're saying it, I might as well say it too, and so on and so forth. These people in power, they really are influential. They largely own the media and dominate the ideological sphere in general. Of course, they have plenty of sway over the education system and all kinds of stuff like that. So, you know, it's really funny when they complain about the degradation of culture and all that kind of stuff, because these are the same elites who largely control that. I'm not going to say they control all of culture, because thankfully they don't, but to a large degree they do shape the narratives. They frame the issues. They kind of decide what we're going to be talking about on a national and international level, and all of that kind of stuff. If you craft and create and control these narratives, well, it's going to have a massive impact on how society functions, and on how we perceive not only others but ourselves. And sure enough, when enough people are raised up to believe that, the military industrial complex is a good thing, and, we should valiantly serve it or whatever, if we think everybody involved is a hero and a GI Joe or whatever, well, then it becomes harder to get away with criticizing these things. And of course, one of the reasons we have brains in the first place, at least supposedly, is so that we can sometimes criticize the institutions and the individuals around us. I'm not saying we should, you know, go to war against everything, but we do have brains that are supposed to call things into question. But if you create a cultural narrative that is dominant and that actually is intensified against any sort of rebellious thought, well, what do you know? Then you can use popular opinion as a cudgel and beat people into submission, and treat people who are critical of power as if they're all just idiots or crazed lunatics. And that's why you always hear about like the bomb throwing anarchist type, but you never hear governments referred to as bomb dropping governments. You know what I mean? It's kind of funny how that works, because one form of violence is praised to the high heavens, and another one is just vilified and really treated as if it's coming from Satan himself. But anyway, uh, back to Don Jr. I got a little sidetracked there. But in March 2026, Republican politicians blocked a subpoena regarding these contracts. So that highlights that in a capitalist, statist structure, political protection is purchased through investment, allowing these wealthy actors to act with impunity. So the radical goofball, silly Billy anarchists would view these scandals surrounding Donald Jr. not as aberrations in a properly functioning system, but as an inherent feature of a state capitalist society. Now, I don't know exactly, how inherent he would say these things are if you're a radical critic, but that's stereotypically what the anarchic argument would be. I personally don't know, like, if I would say anything is particularly inherent. It's a little bit of a struggle to even define exactly what government is, if you really like break everything down, because every society kind of has police functions, for example. So do you say that every society has the same level of government or the same type of government? Well, no, not exactly, because state functions or police functions will look different in every society. So some governments will probably be more violent than others. Some are more culturally controlled by the population, who have more of an interest in regulating the uh, the violence of the state. sort of as a form of revolution insurance, because if governments become too abusive and just too violent, well, it creates instability in society and all that kind of stuff. So, it is a little bit different from society to society, and not every culture in every different country is as corrupt or as, overtly greedy or violent. But whether the government is conspiring with foreign powers for control of the state or using the state to profit private ventures, these actions that I'm talking about really demonstrate that hierarchy is inherently corrupt to the extent that anything can be inherent, and elites prioritize personal profit and power maintenance over everything else. You know, General public safety will be on the chopping block, a scientific understanding of the world and basic human services will be on the chopping block. Concerns for your fellow man and women, of course, women's rights will be potentially on the chopping block. And just, I would say, modern understandings in general will possibly go the way of the dodo, and maybe will devolve to the point where we're just grunting cavemen beating each other with clubs, and like that's the main way that we address issues, you know? So everything basically could be sacrificed to the whims and the interests of the ruling class if we're not careful here. And so far in the United States, under Donald Trump, a lot of things have been sacrificed, and I could go through a long list, but you know, it's just common knowledge at this point that so many things have been slashed, or threatened to be slashed, and we're right in the middle of that. And the state is being used as a business tool. That means government contracts and loans and foreign policy are used to enrich family, and political allies, regardless of which party is in power in some cases. So the Republicans have just made that way too obvious. And that's why, the Democrats are probably going to capitalize on the overt corruption of the Republican Party, namely the Trump crime family, and they'll capitalize on that. But of course, it actually. I mean, I don't want to both sides it too much here, but it really is true that the corporate interests have dominated both parties for a long time, and right now, there's still a little bit of a chance, at least a sliver of a chance, that progressives might be able to actually change the nature of the Democratic Party. I don't know. It sounds like a bit of a dream or something like that. I don't want to dismiss it too much as being naive, but it's a wait and see sort of thing. I don't know how much things are going to change, but there's at least a slight possibility, I would say. And we've also learned that law is arbitrary. Laws are used to control the population, while the elite simply navigate or bypass them. And, we've got a lot of hypocrisy going on with people basically now becoming politicians because they know they can get away with crimes. That's one of the perks of the job is if you well look at the president, like he's got this idea in his head that he has absolute immunity. Well, if you can get away with any number of crimes, why wouldn't you run for president if you are a criminal? If you have no fear of being held accountable, well then it's like it's like the ultimate getaway car. But anyway, that's about it for this episode, and yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years on the horizon, and we'll see if these political dynasties end up crystallizing in some form, or if we end up basically, I guess, sidestepping that whole fiasco.